Britain today faces a future that is more dangerous and more divided.
Yeah, you've been too practical, Sean. Too logical.
Taiwan has stepped up its military on high alert. Naval, air and ground forces at the ready.
To be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
It doesn't just feel like an escalation. Putin and his cronies have leapt on their saber-rattling bandwagon.
So China went on some maybe saber-rattling manoeuvres the other day, and in the Taiwanese area, they do this occasionally, and it seems that what happens is there's something going on occasionally between the West and Taiwan. You know, the relationship gets a bit stronger, or they exchange something or other, and China sort of has a go. That happened recently. What do you think is going on in China's mind at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, part of the reason is probably Taiwan had presidential elections, and the new president has always been pretty clear that Taiwan is independent, and that has definitely upset China. But let's have a quick listen to what the news made of this before we unpack it.
Taiwan has stepped up its military on high alert. Naval, air and ground forces at the ready.
Holding the strong will to prepare for war, not to seek war, to respond to war, and not to back down from war.
Let's give a warm welcome. Its new president, Lai Ching-te, was only inaugurated on Monday.
Right, the South China Sea. Firstly, is why is it important? The South China Sea is the confluence of sort of the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. It's about a third of global trade goes through that area. So if you can control the global trade, remember we were talking with Chris Parody, talked about the potential for charging a tariff to go through, and China wants to be able to control that trade route. Also, underneath the South China Sea, which is not very deep in parts, apparently there are massive resources of oil and natural gas. Something like 11 billion barrels. It was something like 30 years of UK North Sea production of just oil alone. And there's trillions of, what they call it, cubic litres, I think, of gas. But it's a huge amount of resource down there. And also, of course, the coast off the south of China is about 30 metres deep. Now, if you've got nuclear submarines, they can't hide. So they have to leave port. They can be submerged, only just, and you can see them from above. Now, the whole point of nuclear submarines is that they are covert. Taiwan sits right on the edge of the continental shelf. So if you were to put a submarine base just on the east side of Taiwan, you could drop straight off, run silent, run deep, and run it. So there's all sorts of reasons why China has always insisted Taiwan belongs to China, that it will bring it back into its orbit sooner or later.
So do you think this is a rehearsal to see how the West respond, either openly or sort of underneath the covers?
Well, and that's the question, because I think there's been decades of friction between the two. Do you remember, was it Nancy Pelosi that went to visit Taiwan in 2022?
Yeah.
And
I think the
same thing happened.
That's right.
And it was all China. So China's done exactly the same thing 2 years later. What was interesting, was not really pushed out much in the media, when Nancy Pelosi's visit happened, China warned that they were going to respond, and they gave Taiwan a couple of days' notice. This most recent one, they gave them 45 minutes notice. Why is that significant? It's significant because what it means is China's testing Taiwan's ability to react. There's no doubt it would have had all its sensors, its satellites, its listening, its watching devices to go, when we threaten, how is Taiwan going to react? Because they wouldn't know it was a drill or actually an invasion. So my point being is it definitely ratchets up the whole threat. So the real question then is, okay, is China on the verge of doing this? Well, what's fascinating, I've always been a bit of a student of military history. China plays the long game.
Very, very long game.
Very long game, and it thinks strategically. The problem with Taiwan is that as the years turn into decades, Taiwan's population, 22 million or whatever, has become increasingly Taiwanese rather than thinking themselves as Chinese. The polls suggest that. The polls don't suggest they're trying to be separatists because they're smart enough to know that they don't want to provoke a fight. But over time, Taiwan is becoming inexorably more independent.
Do you mean culturally?
Culturally, metaphorically, physically.
And do you think China care about that?
Well, only
in
it
terms
means
of,
if they were going to do a military,
harder.
if they're going to take it over, a military operation, the more motivated the Taiwanese, the more difficult that job will be.
Do you mean the more motivated in fighting a war?
Yeah,
or
that they want to retain their independence.
post-war? Okay, so
it just becomes more difficult as time goes by. So it feels like it's not if, it's when China decides to go in. That's these drills going around.
So you think it's sooner rather than later?
Well, I think the indicators look like that, particularly when China looks across at what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. Did the West step in and NATO jump in and protect Ukraine? No. Has it provided some weapons to Ukraine? Yes. But has it fallen short of directly getting involved? China's almost certainly going to go, America wouldn't be involved. We'd be able to do this. It's about a 3-month military operation, probably. The big question, I think, is Russia is able to withstand the West's sanctions because it produces a load of oil and therefore generates revenue. The fact that we've said we won't buy it, it still gets sold on the global market. China relies heavily on its exports of goods. Years ago it used to be cheap rubber ducks and stuff like that. I'm being flippant for effect. Now it's 5G and other things. But you can only imagine if they went in, they'd be very vulnerable to the Western world just turning off. Made in China.
Yeah.
Stops.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to reduce your dependence on another country, no matter how much you feel they might be a competitor at one end or enemy at the other. That takes time. Obviously, Taiwan is the world's biggest supplier of chips, semiconductors, 50-60% of the normal market and 90% of the top end. We covered this before, 5G, AI, electric vehicles. Yeah. That's a prize to be won. On the other hand, you don't want to take it over and then find that the rest of the world now turns their back on it. I mean, America's rapidly trying to build up a competitive, semiconductor market and doing, reasonably well. Obviously, it takes time. I did hear somebody in Taiwan say if China ever attacked, we'd blow up our industry. I mean, that seems pretty extreme to me, but, So I think it's riddled with complexity, this, isn't it?
It is, and I genuinely don't know. But I think what's fascinating, the US have generally called this strategic ambiguity has been their approach to Taiwan. I think when you look at, people say, oh, what, Ukraine? You go, no, Ukraine was recognized by the international community as a sovereign nation. I think only 11 of the 194 UN nations recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. The Brits don't. America doesn't.
No.
So
it's a game, though. I think that's.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
But if there's an indicator of how far the West would go to protect Taiwan, it looks less likely.
So I actually watched this, and I was either asleep listening or Joe Biden was sleep talking. No. I'll let you decide which is which. He was in a little press conference, which he doesn't do very often. So, he took a direct question. Somebody, almost, I'll see if I can find the clip.
To be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
Given that
it's huge.
Our view is that maybe, wouldn't be the case.
No, and I think, so for clarity here, remember when Putin decided to invade Ukraine?
I don't know when he decided.
No.
I don't remember when he did.
He massed all the troops on the border and he said, I have no intention of going into Ukraine, and then promptly did. Part of this whole narrative of the politicians, whether you call it lying or whether you call it part of strategic ambiguity, leaving a...
doubt.
Yeah, because...
Sure.
But it's very difficult to see. China is just there in spitting distance of Taiwan. America is the other side of the world. I mean, I'm being, again, flippant for effect, but it would be quite difficult for America to make a significant difference. America does sail its nuclear aircraft carriers up and down.
Yeah.
But China's been, there's fake false islands that they've been building.
Yeah.
And you go, why?
Territory claiming, yeah.
Exactly. And it's all part of that whole taking time, step by step.
Absolutely. Yeah, long term. And they've got no green intentions. Well, not in the way the West have got. They have absolutely no interest in being green for being green's sake. What they're interested in is dominating both the non-green, the hydrocarbon industries, and the green industries, wind, solar, being the major manufacturers of all the key parts and the technologies and controlling the raw materials that go into it. With your statement about the resources that exist in that area, they'd want them.
And I think my worry is it might not be my generation that feels this, but China 30 years ago was exporting rubber ducks. I remember Top Gear doing a thing about the cars that they exported that were all copies of Western cars and were rubbish. But China has put loads of people through Western universities. It's bought industries. It's money.
Number one EV business in the world now.
5G, going to them for 5G. Quite. Some of the technology now they are global leaders on, and they're still focusing a huge amount of effort and resource. There seems to me, inevitably, that they're going to accelerate parts militarily, technologically, the West. When that happens, what's the world going to look like then? How secure is the world?
Well, I'm no military analyst. Sean, that's your job. But I don't actually think China wants a war, I don't think wars are good for your economy or for your future role in the world. But I could be wrong. So I think your thing about stealth, strategy, manoeuvring, which eventually there's some kind of international agreement. It's been done before. Might be the plan.
It's a really good point. I'm not sure I'm concluding there'll be a war at the end of this. What I am concluding, I think, is that we see the world through Western lens. I've talked before about Al Jazeera as being a TV channel that when I was in the military, I thought it was, almost treachery to watch Al Jazeera. And yet actually I watch it regularly now and it makes you realize that we often see the news through a Western lens. We see life, we see right and wrong through a Western lens. And China sees a different model for the world order. Not necessarily a US, put a McDonald's on every street corner style of democracy. Now, I'm not protecting China's, but what is evident, Xi Jinping is challenging the global order.
And watching.
Dominated by America, of which we are a party to. And I don't know what that new world order looks like. At the moment, China is aligning itself with Russia, North Korea, Iran, which in my parlance looks like an axis of evil. So it leads me down a path of worrying. But you're absolutely right. I'm not sure that war would suit China, but becoming more assertive on the global stage.
Yeah, definitely. And they think about the small things. If there's some tactical advantage to their strategic goals of doing a small thing, let's say around Taiwan, then China's, because they're a totalitarian state, they've got the ability to do it. I mean, they are messing around north of India, Tibet, 20 or so different territories, all together about the size of Portugal, not very big, but they're just infiltrating, they're defending, they're threatening to block off. And it's a game with India, and there's a lot of strategic assets in that area as well, which China wants, like the Tibetan glacier plateau, which has a lot of water in it. So I wouldn't put it past me for them to be doing exactly what you said at the beginning, which is these are just baby steps to a long-term set of goals. Sean, so far, America has refused to allow Ukraine to use US weapons against Russia on Russian mainland. Recently, they've changed their mind and they've said it's okay. This feels like an escalation in the war.
It doesn't just feel like an escalation. Putin and his cronies have leapt on their saber-rattling bandwagon and have come out with loads of fiery rhetoric around it. It's worth, again, qualifying what was actually said. So the Brits, the Poles, the Germans and the French have already said, we're going to lift the caveat to allow you to use Western weapons on Russian soil. Why have they done that? well, for example, when that second front was opened up recently, a couple of weeks back, Russia had amassed between 30 and 50,000 troops on the border. Ukraine knew they were there, but hadn't got any weapons to target them. And it isn't just the people. You can't have 50,000 troops without having a load of trucks, fuel, weapons, supplies, tanks, vehicles. There's just a massive logistics tail that follows them. But they didn't have the weapons. Now, if you do have the weapons to strike them, that makes Russia think its strategy somewhat differently. The key, though, was America's got this system, ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile System, goes up to 200 miles. And up to now, they said no. Now, they've still said no. They won't let ATACMS be used on Russian soil, but they've lifted the caveat on their other weapons, so Patriots and whatever. What they have said, though, is they must be military targets, not civilian targets. And they've also said they can only be used in the defence of Kharkiv. Quite exactly what that means, I'm not sure. The point being is that I feel that you can't be a little bit pregnant sometimes, these things. You either use them or you can't. I suspect what's happening is that President Biden didn't want to give a carte blanche, but he has ratcheted up a little bit. I think will it change the course of the war? Almost certainly not. Why is it happening now? Ukraine is on the back foot, bluntly. That gap, the 60 billion of weapons that is starting to get through now, but it's going to take a while to address the momentum that Russia has. Therefore, putting a step change in the way that Ukraine can fight almost certainly feels like a really interesting... But, we've talked before about Western political resolve. It is definitely being tested now because Putin has definitely ratcheted up this whole, right, this is, NATO stepping in now. This is now obviously a fight against NATO. Therefore, all you countries that are delivering these weapons, you're now at risk. We're going to hit you. Again, the measured souls around it are all turning around saying that's just the bluster. Just remember, Putin can't win if NATO was to step in. Russia, I remember hearing somebody at a conference I was at the weekend who said Russia's lost most of its military equipment. MOD said that by the end of this month, they think Russia will have lost 500,000 people. 500,000. Huge numbers. And NATO hasn't even started yet. So Russia can't afford NATO to get involved. So it has to do saber rattling to stop it getting involved. So I think part of this is just about timing.
Yeah, well, we heard what Cameron said, and we've covered it already. This is good value for money. Nobody in NATO has lost a life yet. Sad about all the Ukrainian lives.
I think
and 500,000 for Russia.
Yeah, I think for me, what's the other interesting angle that comes out from this, though, is I, as a military analyst, tend to look at these things from a fighting perspective. I was with some very senior political colleagues around Europe last weekend, and just before last weekend, and they're talking a lot now about these three pillars. Military is one. You can't let Russia win on the battlefield. But Ukraine doesn't have to win, it just has to buy time. Another pillar is political pressure on Putin, making him recognise that he can't win. He's been indicted by the International Criminal Court. He started this war as expecting to be over in 3 days. We're now over 800 days into it. At one point, Russia had 17% of Ukrainian territory. Today, it's got about 11%. Whatever metric you look at, it's not all looking good for Russia. And the third one is the economic pillar. And these diplomats are saying, well, actually, Russia's spending 40% of its public spending on defence now, completely unsustainable. It's lost loads of people, millions that have fled the country because they don't want to be involved in getting drawn in. They've lost 500,000 on the battlefield. They used to have foreign reserves of about $700 billion. So you could fund you're spending more than you're earning, but you can fund that out of your savings. That apparently is down at 200 to 300 billion at the moment. So it is going to run out. Interest rates in Russia are still sky high. And the cleverest thing that I heard was, there's been this debate about can we seize Russian money that's been frozen in the West? Something like 200 billion of money, assets that Russia had invested in the West. Can we?
Russia, the country, or the people, the oligarchs?
But Russian money tied up. And there's been a bit of a discussion that no, it's not legal to take that money. But they have decided it is legal to take the interest on that money, because interest is negotiable. Mm-hmm. So now if you say, right, we're going to lock that 200 billion, we're not going to give it back to you, we're not going to steal it, but we're going to give it back to you in 40 years' time. And if that money is earning 5% interest, because if you invested it, it's 5% interest, now that's still only 10 billion a year. But now you convert that to a bond. That bond is worth money, which you can now therefore give to Ukraine up front. And it's some really interesting novel ways that the West is looking at those three pillars: military, political, economic. And their point is that it won't put off Putin, but the real power in Russia lies in the level below him. It's the generals, it's the oligarchs, it's the people who like having their kids educated at Oxford and Cambridge.
So that's pretty neat. So let me just get that straight. So they're going to lock up the oligarchs' money. So they're going to turn it into interest-bearing financial instruments, which they're going to give to Ukraine, so Zelensky can spend that money with the West. I get it.
Yeah, without touching the capital.
Yeah.
So the capital will still be available. So you're not stealing the capital, but Putin, you can't have it back for 40 years.
Yeah. So they're swapping rich people in Russia getting richer, which is, maybe a good thing to do. Swapping that for rich people in America getting richer.
Well, but giving the money to Zelensky.
So he can spend it in the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to see the conversation shifting from
That's quite clever, yeah.
You've got to only focus on the military angle to going, okay, because military analysts will turn around and say, it's going to be really difficult for Ukraine to liberate its lands militarily. If the power base, as history has shown in Russia, snaps and says, right, Putin, you're out, because actually this isn't in our interest. We need to get somebody else in. Somebody else comes in, brokers right, how do we reset the datum again?
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
So I think that's the interesting line we're seeing out of Ukraine.
So America gave Ukraine 31 Abrams tanks. Ukraine decided apparently to use them in a very conventional way. That made them vulnerable. 5 of those tanks have been destroyed. What the Russians apparently done is they have 2 types of drone. One gets shot into the air, finds a tank, sends a signal to the other drone. That drone, $40,000 worth.
Got it.
And blows it up.
Yeah.
And five tanks been destroyed. So jointly they've decided to withdraw and get the Abrams tank out of harm's way. I mean, that sounds pretty bad, particularly going back to the power of such a cheap piece of weaponry. Of course, the other side of it is Russia's lost 3,000 of their tanks, which is, I think you've said, the majority of their modern tank inventory. So you have to sort of put that in perspective. And I've seen an amazing film of what the Russians have done to, what they've done to those tanks. They've shrouded them in a metal casing. They look like some Dalek, in the hope that the thing will just sort of bounce off the side, and all you see poking out the front is a foot of the turret. And they're building canopies over the top to stop the stuff coming down from the sky as well. That sounds very Fred Karno and pretty desperate, doesn't it? Don't you think?
No, it does. And I think we've talked about drones before. I think it's fascinating, the whole piece about drones. Going back to your initial point, I mean, I think what's fascinating about modern battle tanks is they are incredibly capable, incredibly well protected, but only if they're used in a certain way.
That's what apparently there's a lot of talk about doing it in that way, but
Yeah, and one of the ways I understand is that because Ukraine has been running short of artillery, firing up and down on your enemy, another way of doing it is to fire at your enemy. And things like a tank are very good at pointing, and with laser-guided munitions or laser targeting, can fire 2 miles a shell with ruthless accuracy. So if you don't have the artillery pieces, why not bring your tanks forward and start schwacking Russian tanks using the barrel of a modern tank? Now, of course, what Russians do, get a bloody nose, they lose a load of tanks, then they go, hang on a minute, these tanks are all out in the open, we can now find them now. They're not being used as they should be used, fire and maneuver, yes, protection. They're now just standing and becoming an artillery piece. So they're vulnerable. Russia's been successful at getting them. I think the bit about the Russian tanks is fascinating as well. We talk about numbers. I haven't looked up the number, but the last time I did, it was about the Russian inventory. It was about 13,000. You think, bloody hell, that's a huge number. When you look at it, they've got loads of pre-war and post-war, Second World War tanks that they keep in storage, and they've been starting to wheel some of them out. Now, yes, they can fire around, but they can't do it on the move. The protection afforded is no protection against a modern anti-tank weapon, but if you're running short of that,
you put a turtle shell around it.
And that's what, protect all these protections to go, right, the Ukrainians were dropping hand grenades through the open hatch, right, put a bloody windshield on the top, therefore you can't tell, and it'll bounce off the top. And you get all of these, innovations happening around the margins.
It's desperate, that is.
Yeah. But I think the bottom line is the Abrams tank is an incredibly effective tank. I think what you're also seeing now, do you remember there was Russia was showcasing some of the Western kits that they've captured to prove that NATO is involved.
Okay.
And they've got a couple of Abrams tanks on show. For me, that was a really interesting insight into why America spent so long deciding whether to send those tanks. Because some are going to fall into Russian hands. And when they do, the Russians will study every millimetre of its capability. Where the thickness of the armour, where's the thinnest armour, where's the most vulnerable point? How do you take these apart? How do you jam the radar? How do you jam the sight? And when you've got one actually to use. So the next question is, these Abrams tanks have been in production for a long time. America will not have given them the latest technology tank. So how obsolete a level of technology do you give the Ukrainians based on the fact you want them to have the most effective they can, but you also know it's going to fall into Russian hands?